Pence addresses the latest Trump indictment. Brad Chambers running for governor, plus Dr. Caitlin Bernard denied an award, and more. From the television studios at WFYI, it's Indiana Week in Review, for the week ending August 18th, 2023.
Indiana Week in Review is made possible by the supporters of Indiana Public Broadcasting Stations.
This week, former Vice President Mike Pence addressed the latest indictment of Donald Trump, saying no one is above the law and that Trump deserves the presumption of innocence. Pence spoke to Republicans at a National Legislative Conference in Indianapolis Wednesday. The latest indictment is in the state of Georgia, with Trump and others accused of a conspiracy to overturn the election results there in 2020. Pence didn't directly say whether he thinks Trump is guilty, but he also didn't shy away from criticizing him either.
Despite what the former president and his allies have said for now more than 2.5 years, and continue to insist to this very hour, the Georgia election was not stolen, and I had no right to overturn the election on January 6th.
Pence says he had hoped judgment of Trump's conduct around the 2020 election would be left to the American people and to history. Is Pence still trying to have it both ways on Donald Trump? It's the first question for our Indiana Week in Review panel. Democrat Destiny Wells, Republican Jennifer Hollowell, John Schwannis, host of Indiana Lawmakers, and Nikki Kelly, editor-in-chief of the Indiana Capitol Chronicle. I'm Indiana Public Broadcasting State House Bureau Chief Brandon Smith. Jennifer, we've talked a little bit about this on the show before, but in this speech, Pence says the Georgia election wasn't stolen, but I wish Donald Trump, the judgment of Donald Trump was left to history and the American people. No one is above the law, but he deserves to be thought of as innocent first. Is he still trying to have it both ways?
I don't really think that's a fair way to frame it up because first and foremost, the most important things that he has said are that the election was not stolen, Trump lost the election, and he had no right to overturn it. That is a message that especially Republicans need to hear often and from more people. So, I think that's incredibly important. As for the rest of it, it's not really his place or hardly anybody else's place to weigh in on whether or not, what they think of the indictments and how the process is going to play out. That's going to play out in court. And frankly, as a candidate for president, as they all are kind of grappling with, it's a balancing act because there's still a significant chunk of Republicans who support Donald Trump. So, I think it is probably the path that most of those candidates are going to take, hopefully being honest about what happened in 2020. But there's no upside to getting in the middle of it.
Yeah. I think, I don't think Mike Pence is going to win a lot of hardcore Trump voters over, considering they wanted to quite literally hang him on January 6th. So is this a strong statement from Pence saying, very decisively, the Georgia election wasn't stolen and no one is above the law?
I don't think it's strong. I mean, you just said he flip-flopped, right? And when you really look at how these campaigns work, they're not really calibrated to tell the truth. They're calibrated to tell what the voters want to hear. And I think everybody's watching this litigation unfold, and they're not sure what voters want to hear. They probably have polling going on in the background, and we're seeing that with him in front of his campaign, kind of flip-flopping on wanting to have it both ways, like you said.
The line that stuck out to me more than anything else, I mean, certainly the Georgia election, very clear. That was big, and that was important, as Jennifer just said. But the line that stuck out to me in the other direction from Pence was, I wish that the judgment of Donald Trump had been reserved for the American people in history. Well, that's nice if Donald Trump has simply gone away, but he's the leading Republican presidential candidate, and also, he's going to face juries which are made up of, I'm pretty confident, American people. Isn't that facing the judgment of the American people? Isn't the legal process how that plays out?
Yeah, I think Mike Pence is trying to have, it's a delicate balancing act, but he's not going quite as far as others saying that the Department of Justice is being used as a weapon or, prosecutors are being used as a weaponization in politics. He's not going that far. So I am glad of that because, these are all independent investigations, some federal, some not, all with jurors grand jurors who voted on these indictments, people, voters, Americans. So I'm at least glad that he's not, taking that approach. But he's reserving a little bit of space for himself.
To that end, he's not going as far in either direction as other Republican presidential candidates are. The vast majority of the field going the direction Nikki just talked about. A few in the field, Will Hurd, Asa Hutchinson, Chris Christie, going the other direction, which is Donald Trump is a criminal who shouldn't be allowed to do anything, let alone run for president ever again, and it's an embarrassment, etc. Is that, we talk about lanes all the time. We're going to talk about it in the next topic as well. But is that a lane that he can have some success in? Which is, I'm not necessarily making everybody who agrees with the side Nikki just talked about, I'm not really angering them too much by not going as far anti-Trump as I could, but at the same time, I am appealing to people who are maybe fed up with Trump or think he didn't do the right thing.
Well, it's very Mike Pence. Mike Pence, we've talked about before, is someone who is an accomplished communicator. I mean, former television host, radio host. I've debated with him and against him, and he's formidable. But it's not the kind of formidable in the current political climate where, and we'll see with the debate, but where it's red meat, it's put downs, it's gotcha, how you can slam dance your opponents. And I think that same approach of sort of the scholarly or lawyerly, judicious approach, which you could say he's taking here, would play well in a debate setting if somebody were judging, the merits of your debate performance or the legitimacy of your points, or maybe with a general election. But let's keep in mind that his audience right now is a very, seemingly, by all the polls we've seen, a very conservative, very activist, reactionary, use whatever adjective you want, faction of the Republican Party, which doesn't have much interest in hearing nuance. On the other hand, this and that. So it doesn't seem to me to be a winning strategy politically. I'm not saying it's good or bad in the sense of
good or bad, but not
in the sense of humanity.
Winning.
But if somebody asked me for political advice, I'd say one or the other. And one, you can't go with the people who wanted to hang you because you're not going to win them over. So that leaves you one lane, and it's pretty far. It's more the Christie, Asa Hutchinson, Will Hurd path than it is the other path.
All right. Well, I teased it a second ago. Indiana's crowded Republican primary for governor has another candidate. Brad Chambers, who recently stepped down as Indiana Secretary of Commerce, threw his hat into the ring this week. Chambers served 2 years running the Indiana Economic Development Corporation, and he says that service is helping drive his decision to run for governor. In a statement announcing his bid, he repeatedly uses the word vision, emphasizing that Indiana needs someone with urgency and ambitious aspiration to help lead the state. Chambers helped oversee a shift in economic development strategy at IEDC, with a recent emphasis on spending hundreds of millions of dollars to buy up land and prepare it for companies to locate on without knowing whether that investment will pay off. Prior to his time in state government, Chambers led a real estate investment firm for decades. He now joins a GOP primary that includes U.S. Senator Mike Braun, Lieutenant Governor Suzanne Crouch, Fort Wayne businessman Eric Doden, and former Attorney General Curtis Hill. Destiny Wells, considering who's already in the field, including an independently wealthy former head of the Indiana Economic Development Corporation, does a Brad Chambers run for governor make a lot of sense?
I think probably in the echo chamber of the establishment that he's listening to right now, it does make sense. You have a lot of candidates. It's fractured, and so maybe somebody with no low name ID like Brad Chambers, it would make sense. However, I'm not sure that he's going to resonate with a lot of the electorate outside of that establishment. If you are known for taking farmland, stealing water, you may not resonate with rural Indiana. So billionaire Brad may have some problems when it comes to rural Indiana.
I feel like so many things I could use to describe Brad Chambers, I can use to describe Eric Doden, who's been in this race for 2 years. What does Chambers see that the rest of us don't seem to see?
Well, at first I'd say it seems like the Democrats are worried about him, so we could start with that. I think that because there are 4, now 5 candidates in this race, and some have been in for months, some have been in for years, but yet it's interesting that it still feels like a pretty wide open race. You haven't seen any significant consolidation, so I think there's opportunity for a new candidate to enter. There are multiple paths to victory, I would estimate, and think about just the numbers. Depending on how it goes, you may not have to have 50% of the vote. You may not have to have what those numbers are. Well, is going to be really telling. And he's just coming off of a 2-year stint overseeing the state's most significant economic development and job creation in state history. So the contrast with them obviously is the most recent, last couple of years versus a record previously. But I think there are several strong candidates who have a case to make, but it's pretty clear that after this amount of time, there's still opportunity, and I would expect that he's surveyed that.
When Curtis Hill joined the race, in addition to some other stuff we talked about with Curtis Hill, we talked about who should be most worried of the candidates who were already in, of Curtis Hill taking support away from them to himself. Should Eric Doden be really concerned here?
Conventional wisdom would suggest that is, let's go back to the terminology that you used and set the stage with this discussion with, and that is lanes. They're both, if this were a swim meet or a track meet, they're both jockeying for the same set of blocks or the same, whatever one calls a spring meet. What do you call it at a swim meet? It's been a while, but with that, the same place you jump off to start the
Sure.
technical term, if we may. And that's where that would seem to be the message, not just the message, but the credentials, the background, very similar with the two of them in terms of their focus on economic development and making sure that Indiana is well positioned for economic growth, ideally, in the 21st century. But again, I go back to what I said a minute ago, is that it seems to me a general election strategy and what's saleable in a general election is so dramatically different from what is needed this day and age in a primary in either party. I mean, again, primary voters are an active group within their parties, R&D alike, and you're going to get more of a less pragmatism probably and more about philosophical purity in both veins. And in that way, you do question whether, from a pure strategy standpoint, to the extent that there is still a faction of establishment Republicans, and I guess anyone's guess as to how big that faction is, but that is the uncrowded lane, or essentially the lane that nobody's in, period. And it seems to me that in a race where there's a lot of voter fragmentation, as there always is when you have more than 2, 3, 4 qualified candidates, equally well-funded candidates, you're going to want to go where nobody else is.
Obviously, Brad Chambers, he already has started, will make a lot out of. He's just finished running 2 years of the IEDC. Look at all of the jobs, look at all of the commitments we brought in, look at all the investment we brought into Indiana. But unlike a lot of heads of IEDC in the past, Destiny pointed this out, that strategy has not come without pissing some people off, quite frankly. Maybe not a lot of people, but it's made some people upset. Is that going to be a problem for Brad Chambers?
Yeah, I mean, one thing in their own press release they counted as a success was launching the LEAP district in Boone County. Well, first of all, I mean, we don't even have a single job out there yet. So we've spent hundreds of millions of dollars to buy land. They are voluntary sales, but obviously people in Boone County have felt pressured. We've spent a lot of money on those land purchases, way above value. We still only have one commitment in that thing, and now you've added this $1 billion pipeline we're going to build, taking water from Lafayette down to Indy. So that's definitely controversial, and I don't think we know in any way whether that's a success yet or not. Overall, to me,
and we're not going to know before people are casting their votes next year.
The key thing I see from Brad Chambers entering is he's the mystery. I know literally nothing. Someone asked me, is he stridently conservative? Is he more moderate? Is he, socially conservative? I have no idea. He's a complete mystery, and in some ways he gets to, I guess, use his money to define himself now.
Yeah. All right, time now for viewer feedback. Each week, we pose an unscientific online poll question, and this week's question is, can former Commerce Secretary Brad Chambers make an impact in the GOP gubernatorial primary? A, yes, or B, no? Last week we asked you, is the latest round of college sports conference realignment good for student athletes? Just 15% of you say yes, with which I happen to agree. 85% say no. If you'd like to take part in the poll, go to wfyi.org/IWIR and look for the poll. Well, Governor Eric Holcomb this week said his office followed the correct process when it blocked Dr. Caitlin Bernard from receiving a state award given to Indiana women who make contributions to their community, state, and country. The Indy Star first reported that Bernard had been recommended to receive a Torchbearer Award before the governor's office stepped in. Bernard has been in the spotlight for over a year since she provided abortion care to a 10-year-old rape victim from Ohio and then discussed the case with the Indy Star. Targeted by Attorney General Todd Rokita, Bernard was eventually reprimanded by the state medical licensing board earlier this year. Holcomb says that case before the licensing board is why she was taken off a list of recommended recipients for the Torchbearer Award.
It's consistent with the process that if an applicant is involved in a legal proceeding, then maybe it's not the appropriate time for that individual, but there may be a time in the future.
Nominees for the award are chosen by a panel of past recipients. The governor's office has traditionally cleared the list of final nominees, though award judges told the Indy Star they were only told the nominees needed to pass a background check. John Schwanitz, how big a deal is this?
Well, we're talking about it now, not that that's necessarily the indication that it's a huge deal, but anything that has to do with this issue now, it's going to explode into public perspective, it seems to me, because the feelings are so strong on each side. You know, you look at the requirements for the reward or the award, and there didn't say anything about these types of additional prerequisites. You can't be involved in any litigation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it does seem as if that's backfill. You know, what kind of justification can we come up with that's somewhat legitimate other than saying somebody has an opinion that we may not like? And that's what it feels like. Now, long term, no one probably is going to be talking about this in a month or two, but guaranteed, any issue that has to do with reproductive rights in the state's ongoing attempt, at least in the General Assembly and the executive branch, to curb that right is going to get attention that it never would have in the past.
I mean, the thing that struck me was, and the Star story pointed this out, Betty Cochran received this award. Betty Cochran was the longtime notable head of Planned Parenthood, received this award a few years back. So, and from that angle, Planned Parenthood was constantly involved in litigation against the state of Indiana. Does this explanation hold water to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think like with most of these things, it's about transparency. I mean, the group of judges who voted on this recommendation clearly were never told none of these people can be involved in litigation because, you know, I mean, why would you even have them do that work and do the background check if that was going to be an automatic checkoff? You know, that should be at the front end, not the back end, which I think goes to say that the governor's office was probably surprised to get that unanimous recommendation and kind of had to scramble a bit.
To that point, I mean, this is a bipartisan group of judges. These are not all Democrats and certainly not all Republicans, but you know, they knew who Caitlin Bernard was while this was going on, after this, at the point when they recommended her, the medical licensing board had already made its decision. They simply hadn't officially finalized it, which takes place, like, I think it's 90 days later, 60 days later. Just a matter of writing it up.
Right, exactly.
So they knew this was going on. They took it into consideration, still gave a unanimous recommendation. So again, I'll ask you the same thing I asked her. Does this explanation from the Holcomb administration hold water?
Absolutely not. I mean, what this message sends is that, or what this says is that women cannot be trusted to choose who their own heroes are. I mean, this was a bipartisan selection committee of former awardees. And you know, I believe I remember the governor saying last year that despite the character of the person, if they were a benefactor of the Republican Party, he would vote for them. So I'm pretty sure that Dr. Bernard is not a Republican and in fact one of the enemies of the party after the Attorney General's attack on her last year.
I agree with John. I don't think that this will last much longer, obviously. I think we're talking about it now. It's notable right now, but I don't think it'll be remembered long after. But in the midst of a time when doctors, and particularly doctors in Caitlin Bernard's profession, OBGYNs and the like, are taking a long look at whether or not they want to continue to stay in the state of Indiana. Does this add one more piece to that puzzle of trying to figure out whether this is a welcoming place for folks like that?
I doubt it. I think that's overblown. I think your characterization is really over the top. I don't think that the governor or anyone in the administration doesn't think women can't choose their own heroes. To me, this is a kind of common sense situation that is not terribly surprising. I mean, even if it was just after the medical licensing board, the state medical licensing board just found that. So I just think I think that's probably also a little bit different than some other scenario. So I just think it's kind of blown out of proportion.
Keep in mind when you look at new rules of engagement for these kinds of competitions or recognition processes, that at any point the head of state government, the governor of this state or any other, is often cited in lawsuits as a defendant. And I'm guessing, I have not checked this out, I may be wrong, but I don't think I am. There are any number of suits probably pending where, because of his role as the head of state government, Eric Holcomb is involved in litigation as a defendant, as are probably every other governor in this country. So I guess that
Sure.
puts the kibosh on
And I
any
also bet that
opportunity for similarly situated individuals to ever vie for this award.
I think this all seems different to me. Sure, I'm sure that's the case. I'm sure there are other candidates who may have been named in or got a speeding ticket or something. I just think this is a particularly different, unique situation that makes sense.
But why say it's because of that reason, though? I mean, if you want to say it's because of you're saying it's different, and I
think that
stipulate, I'll agree with you,
particular
it's different.
case
It's different
is
because
different
it's politically charged.
Mass, litigation that the governor's named in on a state or any other kind of situation where it's not just primarily right here, right now.
Reading competency for Indiana's third graders is stagnant and remains near the lowest point in a decade, according to just released data this week. From WFY's Education Desk, Eric Weddle reports why there's so much concern for young readers.
In third grade, students take a literacy assessment called I Read 3. Passing it is a crucial milestone because it shows whether a student can learn from reading text and comprehending it. But nearly 1 in 5 students failed the test. Education Secretary Katie Jenner says the struggle to teach Indiana students to read has been going on for a decade.
And I think it's key for us to acknowledge, for schools to acknowledge, as we urgently have to overcome this.
Jenner and lawmakers are hopeful that a new law mandating a reading curriculum aligned to the science of reading will lead to improvements, but results could take years.
Something.
Nikki Kelly, Katie Jenner talked about this. Is the pandemic still being used too much as an excuse by some to mask deeper issues in the education system?
I think it is time to look, we see the direct impact, but it is time to look further into how we can do this. And I think there was an interesting discussion at the state board about a few reasons that might be causing this. One of them was looking at truancy, that a lot of these students who aren't proficient are missing too much school, and whether we need to work with prosecutors on that. I think we very rarely retain kids anymore. But Katie Jenner told us that I think it's like if you reach 169 days a year, if you're in school 169 days a year, your chances of passing the standardized testing goes up dramatically. And so I think that's a fair discussion if we start looking into transportation issues, truancy issues, and we've got to move past the pandemic at some point. We are where we are, and we're still, they were in school all last year, and we still didn't improve.
We're also, as a state, looking at how we're teaching kids to read. We just saw legislation this past legislative session from, among others, Senator Aaron Freeman, who's really passionate about this topic, about the science of reading and how we need to get to the best possible way to teach kids how to read. The problem is, of course, that as we're starting to introduce that, it's going to take a little while for that to show up. Taking a glass half full approach, is it at least good that we aren't continuing to drop?
I think there's something we can all celebrate, right? I was joking, they don't make foam fingers for we're number 40 whatever that you can wave in the stands, but Sure, it's better not to drop. I mean, but at the same time, when you're talking about something as fundamental as the proficiency, which is a building, in this subject area, which is a building block for the rest of an educational career, it's tough. And to Nikki's point, you can't blame pandemic forever. And this has to do with everything from parental involvement and stability on the home front and accountability of parents who might or might not say, did you do your homework tonight? Let's sit down and do this, read a book, whatever. To nutrition, or kids going to school where their stomach's saying, forget about, the phonetics of reading, sounding out that word, I just need something in my stomach. There's so many issues, personal safety issues. If you can't feel safe in the classroom or on the way to and from the classroom, that's not going to help either. So it's a holistic issue. It's easy to break it out, but it's a tough nut to crack.
All right, that's Indiana Week in Review for this week. Our panel is Democrat Destiny Wells, Republican Jennifer Hollowell, John Schwanitz of Indiana Lawmakers, and Nikki Kelly of the Indiana Capitol Chronicle. You can find Indiana Week in Review's podcast and episodes at wfyi.org/IWIR or on the PBS app. I'm Brandon Smith of Indiana Public Broadcasting. Join us next time, because a lot can happen in an Indiana week.
The opinions expressed are solely those of the panelists. Indiana Week in Review is a WFYI production in association with Indiana's public broadcasting stations.